Hello and welcome to Ditching Hourly. I'm Jonathan Stark. Today I am joined by guest Robin Bonn. Robin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleased to be here.
Today, Robin and I are going to talk about his new book, Market of One, which is about niching down and specializing and being meaningfully different to your buyers. So, longtime listeners here are going to know that this will be a good conversation. But first, Robin, could you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, no, I'd love to. Thank you. So yeah, I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Codefinery. We're a specialist consulting and coaching practice for agency businesses of all shapes and sizes. So we're probably best known for repositioning work, and we've repositioned. I don't know, must be nearly 150 agencies now over the last 10 years or so. And that's shops of all sizes and disciplines and geographies and ownership models as well, from the holding company owned agencies right down to tiny agencies in outside of the major cities. So we kind of we don't look at size and scale as being the key thing for us. I suppose right now I'm really focused on helping agency leaders rethink how differentiation works and obviously how to grow in a world that's being turned upside down by AI. I think for me that's the long term game, is to really enable all agencies to make great money while still loving what they do.
Great. That's a perfect start. You preaching to the choir here for sure. So, I talk about positioning and differentiation quite a bit because my main focus is about uh, pricing, and you can't command high fees if you appear to be exactly the same as the next agency down the road and the one after that, and the college kids that'll work for pizza and exposure. So, if you're not different, it's just value-based pricing or high fixed fees. It just doesn't work because you need to be different in some way that's meaningful to your buyers, or you have no pricing power.
Mm.
So it's a subject that comes up a lot. I've certainly haven't repositioned over 100 firms. So I'm really looking forward to getting some in the trenches advice for folks listening who could maybe apply your expertise to their business, because almost everyone listening is in their marketing probably is coming across as a generalist to their potential audience. So let me start like this. You use in the book, I noticed terms like niching down and specialization and differentiation. How do those things relate to each other? Are they synonymous, or do they just have an interplay that works together?
I love that as an opening question. Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that I think is sort of underdeveloped in the conversation around all those things, specialization, niching, focus, whatever you want to call it, we don't think enough about the language we use and the implications of it. So without getting into some sort of intellectual kind of noodling around, I think it does matter what we call these things, because a lot of what stops great agencies being different is fear and inertia, and perceived best practice and so on. Like, we've always done it this way, everyone else does it this way, so it's too scary to change, or I'm running too fast to slow down, in the case of a lot of small businesses particularly. So I worry about the word niching. I'm quite critical of it in the book, because when I hear the word niche, and I think a lot of people, when they hear the word niche, they hear small and narrow. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with being a niche, let's call it agency in this case, niche provider of whatever it is that you do. But it's not the only way to do it. And I think that's the thing, is that when people hear small, they worry about cutting off vast swathes of opportunity, or needing to have a much kind of more tightly defined set of talent in the business, or whatever else. So I think the word specialize is it's kind of the same but not as bad. I've often stood on stage in front of a room full of agencies and talked about specialization and asked why they don't, and they say, well, we don't want to get stuck in one sector. What if we're in travel and then there's a pandemic, that kind of thing. Or what if we're in finance and everyone gets bored of doing finance? It's like, well, obviously, a vertical sector is just one example of specialization. So I think we need to be really, really specific that actually, a WPP or an Omnicom or a Publicis, they are highly specialized niche businesses. In as much as, if you are a global advertiser and you want a large global marketing services firm to service your business, you have a small group of specialized businesses to choose from. And it's just the same as if you are, a small, SEO agency servicing, the IFA market, for example. Same principle, totally different scale. And I think that takes a lot of the fear and inertia out of that conversation from the start.
So, what term do you use? Do you use specialization?
I use specialization a lot because I think it's something that people recognize. I think it's easier to push back on the word niche because most people will agree that sounds small. But I think more often than not, it's really a question of strategy. I would argue that if you don't specialize in something at all, then you don't really have a business strategy. My sort of default test for this is particularly for an industry like ours where we get so caught up in all the jargon and the buzzwords and all the rest of it. And obviously, AI has given us a whole new lexicon of crap to say. It doesn't mean anything. The test is like, would this work if you were to go to an investor and try and secure funds? If you could describe your differentiation, describe effectively your business strategy in simple jargon-free language that a layperson, an interested adult layperson, could understand, and you could sort of survive the interrogation that someone that you're asking for money would kind of place you under, then you probably got the makings of a strategy. So it's simple stuff like, well, what are we really good at? Where do we win? What's the opportunity as we see it? Where's the puck heading, if you like? Why are we well suited to meet that opportunity? What do we need to do to realize it? What do we need to not do? How would we invest this money? It's those kinds of questions I think that speak to strategy, and really, if you answer those well, then you're probably starting to think about differentiation and specialization. So that's how we get through it.
That's really interesting. I don't know, probably very few people listening to this have ever been in a position to be asking people for money, like an investor style thing. But it's probably not too hard to imagine. I mean, if you think of Shark Tank or, it's probably something that you could put yourself in those shoes and just imagine someone saying like, well, okay, you're asking me for $1 million. What are you going to do with it? Like, how
Do
am
you know
I
what?
going to
It's the
get a
same.
return on
It's the
investment?
same if you're in a pub or a bar with your friends and they say, "Hey, you do something with like advertising, is it? What is it that you do again?" You'd have to strip out all the buzzwords and you'd have to talk about it in simple terms. Why would anyone care? Is really a similar question. Whether it's asking for money or whether they should care, it's just simple language to express what actually you do for a living that's interesting and different.
Okay. So now generally I talk about, I try and, well, first, let me say that I've gone around all the words, used all the different terms, and I found pushback on all the words. So I've gravitated to specialize. That is still kind of vague and is interpreted in different ways by different people. Niching down is wildly misinterpreted. So I tend to get away. I tend to move away from that one
Mm,
because people always perceive it in a very specific way, which is not. I think it's inaccurate. They always imagine it you're niching down on a particular vertical,
100%.
and right, so it's like, no, that's just one way. But so I just basically, I pretty much, I probably haven't stopped using it, but I use specialize more. But even with specialization, there's sort of two dimensions to it, at least two dimensions to it. There are two that I talk about all the time. So I want to get see how similar this is to the way you view it. I think of it as specializing in I always talk about an Etch a Sketch, which was like a toy when I was a kid that had these two dials
Yeah,
and you
I
could
had one of
move
those.
horizontally or vertically. And one dial is the horizontal dial. And to me, that's the stuff you do. So it's your skills or the stuff your people are really good at. It's kind of like the thing you'd put on a resume. It's something you have control over. It's the thing that um, it's like your expertise, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. And then the vertical dial, the up and down dial, is who you do it for. And so you can specialize in the things that you do, and you can specialize in who you do the things for. And I think over specializing in both directions or maxing out your specialization in both directions puts you in this upper right hand quadrant where there's probably not enough market that actually wants the thing that you do. Maybe you could come up with counterexamples to that, but generally speaking, it's like, if you do something highly specialized and you only do it for Jeff Bezos, well, okay, maybe if you do it for Jeff Bezos, you can make a nice living. But if a market of one, like a buyer, if there's only one buyer, that'd be like maximum specialization. So that buyer better have a lot of money. But usually people are in one of the two, the top left quadrant or the bottom right quadrant, where they're highly specialized in their on what they do, and they're sort of general in who they'll do it for, or they're highly specialized in who they want to work with and who they want to help, and they're a little bit more general in their skills. They're a little bit more like what you'd consider a full service agency, but only for a very, very specific kind of market. So when I when I talk about it, and I want to get your feedback on what you think, is these two dimensions of specialization, and you kind of dial in to a point where you have found white space where no one else is sort of got this combination of skills for this specific segment of the market. Does that map to anything in your book?
It does, and I think there's some really important nuance in that debate. So, at a very high level, I think it's absolutely right. If you can do something for someone, then you're probably in a good space in terms of moving towards some kind of, let's call it, specialization for the for the purposes of using one word and not explaining it every time. Um, I think, but as ever with this stuff, like the nuance is where the good stuff lives. So yeah, absolutely, you could do SEO for well, let's use your Amazon example. You could be an Amazon Marketplace specialist for financial services brands, for example. Maybe that's a terrible example. It is a terrible example, but let's run with
Yeah,
it.
I get the point.
You get the point. And I think if you define the who, if you like, of who you're doing it for in the context of just a vertical, then as we've talked about, it becomes very limiting very quickly. It's not wrong.
Mhm.
Again, my business is vertically aligned, but that's a very intentional choice, and I'm conscious that there are other options out there. You mentioned before we came on air that you're not just speaking with agency businesses and consultancies. You've got legal businesses, accountancy practices. So your expertise is being applied on a broader canvas than mine, and
Mhm.
we both do that intentionally. So I think that's the first thing. Don't see the who as just a vertical sector. The second thing I think that's kind of valuable to remember is to not to see the what you do as a set of capabilities or services.
Okay,
I would describe that much more helpfully as the problem that you solve. So one of
that's
the
funny.
issues,
I put that on the other dial. To me, that's the other dial. That's
interesting.
a way to segment an audience.
Well, I agree with that up to a point. I think those two things can end up overlapping. This gets very intellectual and very sort of
Yeah, yeah,
philosophical very quickly, but
yeah.
I think if you solve a certain problem for somebody, if that somebody could be a vertical, it could be a use case for maturity or a scale or an attitude or a mind, it could be anything you like.
Mhm.
But I think to be focused on the problem that you solve, I think the value of that is that it takes it away from your service offering. So I've heard so many agencies say, we focus on, this particular audience, and we're, specialized in bringing together creative and media. And of course, there's no specialization in bringing those two services together because it's so widely available. But I
Mhm.
think again, I'm never short of a medical example, and I think if you're a brain surgeon and you're very good at solving a certain kind of brain uh, issue, then the tools of your trade, innovative uses of keyhole surgery or different types of anesthetic or new ways of thinking about rehabilitation, faster healing. All of a sudden, the way that you solve that problem, you can keep innovating, and you're not limited to the tools of the trade that are widely available. I think the other reason that this is particularly important now is that what I'm seeing with AI is going to continue to democratize agency capability. So any agency that shows up in the market and tries to define itself by virtue of the services that it has, I think are going to find that a lot of the time those services are going to be even more widely available at an even lower price point. And I think agencies need to be mindful of that as we move through what is going to be a very bumpy couple of years, as we sort of move through the sort of mainstreaming of AI.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, this is a great nuance. Um, and you've got me thinking about that, where so the problem is always someone else's. You're not solving your own problem.
Hmm.
So that's why I typically assign it to the other dial. Like, so to me it's like people who have this problem is my niche,
Hmm.
right? So uh and what you just said, this is kind of semantics, but like you said, I think it's kind of important because people have a horrible time talking about this. So this is a great episode to like unpack this stuff, even if we don't 100% agree on our metaphors or whatever. The 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 surgeon example, the brain surgeon example, to me, I would interpret that as like especially specializing in a very specific problem, and so his target market is people with that problem, and he's a bit of a generalist, as you pointed out, in that he's constantly or she is constantly developing their skills and using new tools and being very innovative, and they're really developing their professional capabilities at solving this particular problem. So maybe we could go there next, which is because to me, I mean, like, my website used to be expensiveproblem.com. So it was like for someone who's pricing based on value, the thing that you need to find is an expensive problem. And that expensive problem, if we're not talking about such a specific metaphor of someone who has like a brain aneurysm or something, what can you just thinking of an example of somebody that you've repositioned, if you, not to put you on the spot, but if you can think of like maybe a recent client where you've repositioned them and it was this style of positioning, this style of differentiation where they specialized in a very particular problem. Can you think of an example like that?
Yeah, I'm never a fan of talking about agencies we've worked on because I just think it's a little bit self promotional. So I'd rather hero stuff that other people have done. Um, so uh, I think one of my favorite proposition statements I've ever seen, which is sadly no more, which I think is a shame, was an advertising agency. And by the way, just another sort of linguistic point here is that I think there's a very big difference between positioning and proposition. Positioning
And
for me in our world,
proposition
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. For me, positioning is just the business that you're in. You know, brain surgeon, consultant, undertaker, lawyer, accountant, teacher, artist. That for me is a positioning statement, and it gives me a sense of what you actually do. For me, again, this isn't me sort of saying this is the one true faith. Everyone must follow this, but I find the distinction really helpful in the work that we do, as opposed to your proposition, which is the problem that you solve for an ownable audience. I think if you split them out, then just the reason I do this, the reason I split them out is because I think if you can separate out your positioning from your proposition, it stops a lot of the typical challenges that agencies face, which is they end up re-articulating what their positioning would already do for them very easily, sort of re-articulating the discipline of advertising or re-articulating the discipline of CRM or whatever. So I think if you just get that out of the way, it makes life much easier. So the reason I say that is because the example I'm going to give you, it's an advertising agency, clear positioning. Everyone knows broadly what that means. Their proposition was, we make tired brands famous again. Now, what I love about that is that, for one, it's not something you hear every day. It's clearly something that is a specialist problem that this agency can be extremely expert at solving. And to the earlier example with the brain surgeon, they can go about solving it in all sorts of ways that they can continue to innovate around. But what I love about it is the deeper power of having that kind of clarity of proposition. So they're not just sort of knocking on the doors of brands that they consider to be a little bit, faded, and say, "Hey, look, we think you're kind of a little bit over the hump. You're maybe not as cool as you were. Maybe we can help you." Really, at its heart, it's a highly transformational promise, making tired brands famous again. So these brands used to be famous. Now they're tired. So if an incoming RFP comes from a marketing manager somewhere and says, "We'd like you to pitch for our business. We're thinking about doing an advertising campaign." I think that agency has all the permission in the world to go back and say, like, we're curious about this. We agree with you that your brand is tired, but our approach to this is that we see this as a turnaround conversation. It has to be transformational. Either we need to spend at least an hour with your CEO and their senior leaders to talk about how you see this tiredness, what's brought it along, what you've tried before. Otherwise, there's no point us getting into this and looking at this from a pre-described or pre-prescribed sort of how could we come up with an advertising campaign point of view. So I think the power that it gives you to bring that specialization to an audience that is prepared to recognize that it has, as to your point, an expensive problem, is hugely powerful.
Yeah, I mean that's great. Just for the dear listener, for clarity, I wouldn't say to me the word positioning is much more detailed than I'm a lawyer, I'm a graphic designer. To me, that's just your discipline, or that's the craft, or that's your area of expertise, perhaps. But to me, the positioning does encompass the value proposition, which sounds like what the promise, right? So like this is the thing that we are experts. This is the transformation that we are expert at delivering. So for folks listening, um, don't try to keep that in mind that we don't use the word the same way. So, but I absolutely agree with your main point, which is that if we make tired brands famous again, that what does that do? The main thing that it does to me is that it specifies a target market. An ideal buyer is a brand that used to be famous, not a new one and not a currently famous one. It's one that used to be very well known, maybe a household name, and has sort of fallen out of favor or whatever. They're just they're in the pits compared to where when they were at the top of the mountain. And that's a great I would love that one. And to me that would be part of your positioning, but whatever. And but it's definitely a value proposition. It's definitely the proposition, so I understand why you'd use that term. Mm, Okay, so let's say people agree, they're listening and they agree, and they think that sounds like a good idea, and maybe even the company who the founder of the company for whom this was their proposition thought it was a good idea, and everybody agreed on it. And then a big brand, Procter and Gamble, came along, and they say, "We want you to do the new Fruit Loops campaign." And Fruit Loops is not a tired brand. Let's say I'm just picking one at random. Fruit Loops is not a tired brand, but they're a huge company. They'd love to put it in their portfolio. There's a lot of money on the table, millions of dollars maybe. Should they say no to that?
So I think it depends what they're in business for. So I don't like to be too prescriptive about stuff like this, or too too didactic, or even kind of too dogmatic about it. I think if you're in the business because you want to make money and you want to grow, and you come up with a proposition like that, making Tide brands famous again, for example, because you see it as a stepping stone and you think it's going to get you noticed. But actually, what you aspire to do is to work on, big budget brands like Fruit Loops. You want to be doing Super Bowl ads, for brands which are already at the top of their game. Then that phone call may well be your ticket to the big leagues. It may well be the stepping stone to the next iteration of your value proposition. You may want to step into a far more competitive space where you're going to fight it out with either a different kind of differentiation, or just accept that you're in a bigger, broader marketplace where you know that level of focus is maybe not serving you anymore. However, I would question about whether that is an explicit intentional strategy or not. Because at the other end of the scale, if you have chosen to make tired brands famous again, because it gives you a bunch of stuff that you wouldn't get from going and working on Fruit Loops, and not least, let's not forget that you might not win Fruit Loops because that's not really where your specialization lies. Um, it's what are you in it? What are you in it for? If you're making 30% margin on being a turnaround specialist, you're really enjoying the work. You've got great peer-to-peer client relationships. They listen to you. You've got permission to value price everything that you do. All the benefits that you talk about on a daily basis of being a well-defined expert business. Um, if that's what you're in business to do and it's getting you towards the outcomes you want, then why would you say yes to Fruit Loops?
For the money.
Well, then fine. If you're driven by the money, be driven by the money. But if you're driven by other things as well, you make an intentional choice.
Right. Yeah. So I'm being devil's advocate because you know all of the fears, you know all of the reasons why someone would fight this. And so two things and I love your answer actually, because if the current because it illustrates first of all that your current proposition, whatever we're calling the make tired brands great again, um, it's not forever. It's not necessarily forever. It could be serving a purpose in a larger strategic goal to get yourself to the Fruit Loops level brands, and it's fine. I always say it's not you're not tattooing your position statement on your face. It's like you think of it. I always tell people to think of it like a 6 month campaign, like a 6 month campaign where you're just going to put yourself in the market with a particular value proposition, and if it resonates and you get business, then great. And, if it doesn't resonate, then change it. If it does resonate and you get sick of it in 3 years, then change it. It's like it's not a prison sentence.
So this is really interesting. I think this is maybe a space where you and I slightly disagree as well. So again, back to the earlier point, I think your proposition is the most succinct distillation of your business strategy. And I think when I see, for example, new business.
Current business strategy.
Sure. Now, I'll come back to that nuance in a second. So when I see like new business consultancies, for example, so lead generation companies saying, "Oh, we do propositions," but mainly what they do is do marketing campaigns for agencies. They do lead gen, they do lots of emails, they do lots of cold calling, that kind of stuff. When I see them doing sort of propositions, I think of that more short termist. Let's get it out in the market. Let's see if it works. Let's come up with something which is saleable. I think that's risky for the simple reason that it's relatively superficial because it doesn't have the rigor behind it. Now, at the other end of the scale, where we're talking about fundamental business strategy, which of course isn't set in stone. And of course, if it's not working, you need to change it. But what I'm talking about is an expression of what are you trying to achieve, particularly as the owner or the founder of a business? What kind of life do you want? What kind of, what kind of work do you really enjoy? Where's the fulfillment going to come from? And I think if you answer those questions and get to solid answers on them, the answer might not be, I want to do Fruit Loops work and I want to be competing with the best of the best all day long. And I want to be satisfied with winning one pitch in three. And I want to, an 8% margin business. Those things might not be what you want. So I think if your proposition is a representation of what you truly want from your company, then I think it takes away some of that superficiality. More to the point, going back to let's choose a different surgery analogy, one that's a little bit less distressing. Let's say it's a spinal surgeon. Let's move down the neuros, the neurology. But uh, you're specialist in working with the fourth of the lumbar vertebrae or something like that.
Okay.
Let's get pretty specific about it. And you're a back surgeon is your positioning, and your value proposition is that you are expert at fixing whatever problem with that particular lumbar vertebrae, and you decide to do it for, I don't know, sports people. um, you could be doing that because all your life you've been passionate about sport. And yeah, you went to med school and yeah, you became a surgeon. But the idea of helping elite level athletes across all of your favorite sports get back to that, global level of competition faster than other back surgeons, that's a pretty compelling thing to do. It's pretty vocational, and it brings your passion into play. But more to the point, if you're going to sort of bake the way that you do it into your operating model, and operating being an unintended pun, but uh,
Yeah.
then it's a bit harder to shift, that value proposition with the wind. So, you come back to this idea of, well, we do, we use a different kind of anesthetic because we're always working with very lean sports people with very little body fat. So we can use a different kind at a lower dosage, you recover faster. We've pioneered some amazing surgical technique which leaves you with fewer stitches. Or rehabilitation is something that we push you twice as hard as conventional surgeons because we know that we're working with the top 1% of the top 1%, and you need us to push you harder because you're used to it, blah blah blah. What this speaks to is a concept we talk about in our business called the agency customer experience. So, in effect, what that means is the same definition, really, of CX as that we see out there in the marketing kind of lexicon. But the idea being is it's not really that important what you say; it's what you do as well. So, if you show up with a value proposition which is pretty superficial, and the client's, oh, that's interesting, how do you do that? And the answer to how is like, well, pretty much the same as everybody else. We start with strategy, and then we do creative, and blah blah blah. It's pretty tiring. Whereas if you've got a really clear, set of adaptations that you bring, then I think you give yourself far more permission to demonstrate that what you're offering is deep expertise, that you've adapted your business to really demonstrate your expertise. And I think once you do that, it includes not just things like, structures and processes, and how you onboard clients and how you evaluate, whether employees are right for you, and obviously how you go to market and how you frame what you do. But crucially, I think it gives you much more permission to show up and price differently and sell differently. Uh, so that you're baking that difference throughout the business as opposed to it just being a nice line that you try for 6 months and see if it works.
Right. Yes, I totally agree with all that, and sort of not revealed in my question is that the people that I work with are usually always overly like, passion's not the problem. Being specific about what they do is usually not the problem. They're usually, like, amazing, what I would kind of call a craftsperson at the thing that they do. Like, they know all the best practices, they know all of that. They're the muscle that is weakest in them is empathy with a particular kind of buyer or particular problem, some kind of segment of the population that they want to do the thing for. They just love doing the thing and they want to do it for everyone at a very high level, or anyone, I should say. So, and what you said, I totally agree with, is which is that over time, as you specialize in solving this particular problem, you're going to get so much better at it that there is no competition because you've chosen this focus, and that eventually what happens is it transforms your business because of all this special, like everything you just mentioned. So it's not the kind of thing you could just switch, like, oh, now I'm going to do wrists after I've been this fourth
Perfect. Yeah.
lumbar, whatever you said. So, for elite athletes. But at the beginning, when you're first formulating this, and all of the things that you and I are talking about are theory and not something they've ever experienced. Perhaps they've never even experienced it as a buyer, or at least consciously. How do you help people with that fear at the beginning of things like, oh, what if I choose the wrong one? Or there isn't a particular client that I'm dying to serve, or there isn't a particular problem that I'm dying to serve. I love doing what I do, and I want to keep on doing it for anybody who needs it. So it does feel very arbitrary to people like that when they're just, you mean just pick someone? It's kind of like, or just, or not someone, but just who is this, where is my tired brands?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
this
So,
just, is this a case of introspection, or is it market research?
yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. I think so. We come across that type of founder quite often where, it's classically someone that sort of used to work for someone else, maybe got elevated to a point where they were sort of off the tools, as we say, and starting to manage and didn't really like it, or got sick of being told what to do and wanted to run their own business and set their own hours. But they still have that sort of practitioner mindset where they love doing what they do and they're great at it. And obviously they're talking to you. They probably want to make a bit more money with it, or have a little bit more autonomy, or less like scope creep, better working hours, whatever it's
Yeah,
going to be,
exactly. All those things.
all the things. And I think if you're, sort of so committed to your craft, um, I think there's even stronger argument for kind of going down this route, because there is always, in my experience, going to be client relationships that you've had in the past that are better than others. There will be projects that work better. There will be outputs that you have even more professional pride when you look back on. Inevitably, there will be clients that are more profitable. There'll be projects where you kind of made mistakes and didn't quite scope it right, and all of that. So the biggest principle here in terms of choosing what your equivalent of tired brands is, or indeed famous again, is really to extrapolate from what you love and what you've already done. So there's a bit in the book where towards the end where we talk about objections to creating a market of one for your business, um, and one of them is, well, what if clients don't like it? I was like, well, for one, you're building on the very best of your client relationships. You're extrapolating from the thing that they most value you for. So why on earth they would be frustrated about you getting better at the thing they love you for? It makes no sense. The other thing as well, in the way that we describe our process, and in the way that we work, is that there's a lot of design thinking baked into it. So, for example, validation is a big part of our business. So we're literally taking those clients on the journey with us, so they feel part of it. They feel, to some degree, flattered that they're being invited to contribute, and it feels good for them to be seen as, sort of part of the solution, if you like. So there is always some kind of famous again. There is always some kind of, some kind of equivalent of tired brands. It is, to your point, literally just a question of slowing down, thinking about what you love, looking back over the things that have brought you most fulfillment and money and joy, and opportunities for growth, personally, emotionally, commercially, and overlaying that with, well, what's happening in the market, where's it going, where is demand growing, and finding a space that it feels like it can, it's where the puck's heading and it's where you can be happy. And I think once you sort of frame it in those terms, people can't wait to go there. The fear starts to melt away.
Uh, it sounds great, but I've done this with. I mean, you're probably just way better at it than me. It's not my main thing. But what happens in this situation, because I do the exact same thing, which is like, think back, best successes, and where your most glowing testimonials from, and what did you make the most money from, what felt like you would have done it for free because it was such a great, and it's I mean, and these are people that have been in business. These are not newbies. These are people that have been in business 10 years. They're at
Mm,
the top of their game in terms of their capabilities, and they can there's often not a pattern. So especially for folks I work with, a lot of them have sort of engineering mindset. They want a pattern, and there's not a pattern. There's like, this project was great, but it was because of the our contact person was just awesome. it wasn't about the project, it was about the relationship between me and the contact person. Like, how am I supposed to position myself as someone who has a great relationship with their contact people or likes buyers that are have this worldview or something like that?
I would flip it around.
Okay, yes. What would you do?
Well, just on that case alone, if you find that you have great, you do your best work when you're working with a certain kind of personality, then why not use that as a platform?
Uh, maybe. Can you give us an example of like
Yeah, I mean,
I like to work
it's
with like people named Kathy that are
oh, Kathy's are
45 and
amazing. I do the same. But no, the point being is that a lot of agencies will tell you that why did this project go well? Well, I don't know. It's just like Kathy was
yeah,
really
exactly.
collaborative.
Yeah, they don't know why it
Okay,
went
well,
well, right?
why was Kathy so collaborative? Well, she'd kind of, she had a really clear mandate. She worked directly for the CEO. It was a really flat hierarchy in the company. She was new in role. She had, transformative job title. It was private equity backed, and she'd been brought in by the backers to get change happening faster. Okay, why was that? Well, there were year three of a 5-year change agenda, and the PE company wanted their exit. So you unpack this stuff, and you find out what the conditions were that caused that relationship to feel like it was particularly effective.
So in this model though, there are probably you mentioned probably 5 things that are the tired brand. So it seems arbitrary on which one you pick to use in your messaging, like, you know, PE turnarounds that are in year 3 of 5 or, flat hierarchy, all of them? Do it, and let's say it's all of them. How would the how would the how would that turn into attracting more clients like that? So let's say it's something that's very hidden from the outside. It's not an obvious characteristic.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah, I feel like you're super dependent on inbound marketing. If that's the case, you have no capability to do outbound. Maybe you do just cold calling, but what would you do in a situation like that where somebody describes the Kathy situation and it's flat hierarchy, third year of a 5-year turnaround, PE backed. Okay, what's next? What's the
Yeah, there's a couple of things in here. So first of all, we're having a bit of fun, but clearly it's not. We work for people called Kathy. So
right? But the other
there's
stuff was your examples were great.
no, no, no. But to
Yeah.
get into that, so it may well be that any one of the, let's say, 5 things I mentioned ends up being the right hook to hang it on, whatever it is, whatever that proposition territory is. You can go as niche, in the traditional sense of niche. You can go very, very small with it, or you can go very big with it. We work with private equity backed companies, is pretty broad, or you can major on urgency. You could major on willingness to collaborate. I mean, there's lots of things in there that you could choose to go for.
Did you
I
say
think,
major on?
yeah, 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 yeah.
Like in terms of, like, focusing your messaging on it, or what do you mean by major
Yeah, I
on?
mean, making it your Thai brands or your famous again. That's what I mean by that. No,
Okay,
no
so
bigger.
how would
Yeah,
you so if there are all these options that you could choose, how would you I mean, you want the one that's gonna work. You want the one that's
right.
gonna be the most effective. So how would you test which one was
So
more
yeah, I
effective?
think there's 2 parts of the question. The first one is that you make an informed judgment about the one that feels right and the one that is going to speak to an audience, which is going to sustain you. If it's demonstrably too tiny to generate the kind of returns that you want, but the way we do the work is, we're looking at where those examples have come from. Not just, oh, we did this one project like 5 years ago. It was really profitable. Kathy was great. Okay, let's find more Kathys. It's a bit more rigor to it than that. There has to be
Okay.
some cause for optimism that there are many of those kind of problems out, or enough of the kind of problems out there. And we should say, actually, back to kind of a point I made earlier, that this isn't just about growth for growth's sake. You know, how big do you want your company to be? How many tire brands do you need to work with in a given year? What kind of relationship do you want? What kind of commercial model have you got? So it's always a horses for courses thing. But you're right about the second piece. Is like, how do you, if a lot of these things, if you're not going after the financial services market, and you can't visit the financial services conference, and you can't read the financial services magazine and all the rest of it, how do you go about new business? And it's a really interesting one, because you mentioned inbound and outbound, and I think there's something uh, I've never quite understood why we treat those things so differently. So maybe I'm not as good at this as you are. So maybe you can help me understand it better. But if you've got I always like that old cliche that advertising is worth doing when you've done something worth advertising.
Yeah.
So if you've got a proposition which you've done the homework and it's valuable to an audience out there, it speaks to a problem that they have, then if that proposition reaches them, then they're going to be interested. They're going to lean in, and hopefully you can have a great relationship together. Now, yeah, you can't go to a conference because there's no conference for what we're going to keep calling Cathy's,
Yeah.
and you can't buy Cathy Weekly, on the newsstand.
Right.
But what you can do is, I guess this would traditionally be called inbound marketing. You can market your business on the strength of put a big flare up into the sky on LinkedIn and through your own events or through all the usual channels, and hopefully all the Cathys will see the Cathy shape. I'm going to mix my metaphors. The Cathy back signal above your offices, and I'm really running with this. And
Yeah.
they're going to be drawn to you. And likewise, if you want to do a bunch of what we call outbound, which I'm not quite sure is that different to anything I've already said, if you're going to make a bunch of phone calls or send a load of emails, then yeah, you can make some intelligent judgments about the kind of places where cafes are going to be. But there's a lot of it's a pretty low response rate that you're looking for with, let's say, upscale outbound, email marketing in the first place. So if you're getting a single digit percentage return from that kind of channel, then you're going to get a better response rate with something which is a bit more targeted anyway. So I suppose my broader point is it doesn't really matter how you go to market. It doesn't really change how you go to market if you've got something that the market wants.
Okay, so key point, and this is something I say all the time, which is that I use the word term positioning. If you have a laser focused positioning statement that solves an expensive problem, which to me is a very specific thing, it is a problem that someone would write a big fat check right now to make it go away instantly.
Hmm.
So it is an expense. It's not like global warming is not an expensive problem. It might be an existential problem, but there's no one who's going to write you a big fat check to solve global warming because no one person can solve global warming. But one person can solve like somebody's podcast guesting, like I want to be on a bunch of podcasts. I can literally hire someone to get me on a bunch of podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be an expensive problem for me. So so to your point, if you have nailed an expensive problem, a true expensive problem, then as soon as the right people hear about it, they're going to knock on your door. Whether you send them an email about something else and it's in your signature at the bottom and you don't even mention it in the body of the email, as soon as they see it, they're going to respond because it's that kind of like, there's I don't know who it was. There's like the difference. It's like if your neck's bleeding and you see a tourniquet, you don't care if the tourniquet like interrupted you at dinner. It's like you want the tourniquet right now, and you'll
Right.
pay anything for the tourniquet.
Yep.
Versus aspirin and sort of vitamins versus okay. So, and what I say to people is when you finally nail whatever you want to call it, when you nail this message about this proposition and the expensive problem or your positioning, all the stuff you've been doing on LinkedIn, or if you've been doing advertising or a mailing list or a podcast or whatever, all of the bat signals you've been putting out there, all of a sudden they start working. It's like magic. So, and if you're doing all of that stuff and people are seeing it and your phone's not ringing, it's a sign that it's not the right bat signal. You need a different bat signal. So, I mean, you have a good point, which is, and well, you tell me, is this how you would test? Like, I don't know how far you take it with your clients. So, let's say you've, in theory, identified sort of like this, your Kathy's. You've identified this kind of customer avatar. It's this whole business situation. It's maybe has an expensive problem in it. Do you I mean, then there's like 1,000 ways to message that. So do you get involved with that kind of thing? Or like at what point with your people you work with, how far do you take the sort of call it the strategy and then turn it into tactics? Like what are the actual tactics? Do you get into that or is that you sort of hand off the baton at that point?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So there's really three parts to what we do. Um, the first part is, I mean, we sort of hang it all off of this concept of creating a market of one, and really all that means is that you are you know placing yourself in the minds of your ideal target audience in a way that's really compelling to them, and that you're more compelling at solving that problem for that particular ownable group than anybody else. So you sort of give yourself the opportunity to be the category leader in a space that's defined by what's uniquely yours and you. So it's not about services; it's about what genuinely is different about your business, and they're the kind of things that we obviously discern. That's really the first phase of what we do is what we call defining that market of one. So it's teasing out some of the things that we've talked about and a bunch of other stuff that we have. The second phase is kind of really where it gets practical. I always like to say that after the first phase, you've got a bunch of cool stuff in Miro, but that's pretty much all you've got.
Exactly. Right.
So and frankly, we used to stop there. We were very much a sort of strategic consultancy from like, well done, we've all done something cool. Best of luck with it. Handshake and off we go. What we realized was, of course, there is an awful lot of organizational inertia, particularly in agencies. I think more so than other businesses, which perhaps have a little bit more structure to them. So phase two is all about what we call our rollout master plan. So effectively, that's another planning sprint where we say, okay, we've got the thinking, but what actually needs to happen? What specific changes need to be embedded in this company in order to bring about the outcomes that we want? And again, not just commercially, but in terms of culture, in terms of what the working day looks like, et cetera, et cetera. And once we've figured that out and what those work streams are and who's going to do what and what the risks are and how we're going to mitigate those, that's when we get into the third phase, which is what we call commercial activation, which effectively is the implementation. And then we will, at the very least, we'll oversee that process to make sure that it happens and to, hold the feet to the fire and all of that. And then at the other end of the scale, we'll be very involved with that, depending on what those different work streams are. So that's where we do get involved, not so much with the tactical delivery, but certainly the internal implementation of stuff.
Yep.
So
Accountability, oversight. Yep.
yeah, exactly. It could be definition of product. It could be, work around pricing, for example. It could be organizational design. It could be, very HR driven. It could be all sorts of things. So where we're good and we're needed, we lead. Where, we don't have that core capability, we might bring other people in. We might recommend consultants that we know to help with bits that, are not part of our kind of remit. But that's where I think that it's where the rubber hits the road. And that's why we call it commercial activation, because that's really where you're translating this highly differentiated, lasting competitive advantage in theory into actually, maintaining a price premium over time.
Mm. Is there at what stage in that three-step process do you do validation, if any?
Yeah, throughout really is a short answer. So again, it's back to that design thinking cue. So we're very co-creative. We're very good at showing up with a point of view and bringing our expertise in, but we're also very good at listening. So we're not a consultancy that just disappears off and comes back with the answer and sort of has to sell it in and convince you that it's right. So getting that balance right is really important. And part of that, and again, we'll dial this up or dial this down depending on, frankly, how dysfunctional a business is in the first instance. Making sure that we speak to clients before we start to bring their voice into the room. We often have another phase.
Their clients, or you mean?
Their clients, yeah.
Yeah.
We
Okay.
bring their clients' voice into the room.
Hmm.
And we have, again, a very specific way of having those conversations. So it's not just a kind of classic, client satisfaction call. It's much more forward facing than that. So we deploy that very intentionally, and we use that throughout phase one. We often do that as well at the end of phase two. At the end of phase one before phase two, where it's more of a validation conversation, and that starts to influence the way that phase two takes shape. And frankly, by the time we get to phase three, it's so you started to embed change in the business, then naturally it's coming into contact with clients on a daily basis anyway. So we can maintain those conversations. Often with people that we've spoken to prior, so they've sort of got sight of this coming down the line. They're happy to be involved. They've sort of encouraged the agency that it would be a good thing for those changes to happen. And then, of course, they're very willing to be helpful and to provide feedback and to help, sort of cultivate, the ultimate outcome that everybody wants.
Interesting. This is great. It's such a pleasure to talk to somebody who's gone so much deep. Like, this is a subject that I talk about a lot, but I wouldn't consider myself an expert at it. I understand it, but the the um the expertise and that your focus on this particular thing and all of the nuance that you bring out, it's really got me thinking. It's really helpful. So who's the best kind of client for you? So for people listening, if they wanted to reach out to you to maybe work together, is there, what's the ideal client for you?
Yeah, it's a great question because it allows us to resurrect the Kathy thing, which is fun. Um, And by the way, the Kathy thing, I'm sure no one's thinking this, but just to be clear, it's not about a persona. It's not that granular. We're talking about a problem, and that's just the label that you and I put on it. So for us, obviously, having criticised or at least cautioned against assuming that being vertically positioned is not the whole answer or not the only option. It is an option that we've chosen. So fundamentally, if you run an agency business or a consultancy type business, then you're kind of in our universe. Um, and again, in the same way that making tired brands famous, again, if you're running a brand that's big and well known, that would be the universe. So drilling into that, we talk about positioning. That's our kind of route in, if you like. Even though again, I don't think positioning's the thing, and it allows us to play with that a little bit. Positioning is dead is something I've written about before. But broadly speaking, there are a group of agency leaders out there who are thinking, you know what, we're not differentiated nearly enough. We haven't, we're not making enough money. We're not where we need to be in terms of just adapting to a new world that's emerging through, widespread adoption of AI. We need to think about our business strategy, and we need to do it quickly. So a bit like the tired brands thing, it's not just tired brands because we say so. It's not me saying to the market, you need to sort your business out. It's the people that are already talking about that internally, and they're sort of cognizant that they're going to get there quicker. And not all people in this boat need someone like us to come in and help. But the ones that are saying to themselves, you know what got us here won't get us there. We need to make some changes. We need to do it quickly, and I think we're going to do this faster and better if we get some external specialist expertise in. So there's nuance in there, but in times of change, the people that are willing to kind of get help, they're the people that we have the best conversations with for obvious reasons.
Cool. So, okay. So, I mean, I think people will probably know if you're listening, if you're not differentiated enough in the market, if you're losing work to people who you consider to be far inferior, but clients can't tell the difference except for your price is higher. So let's go with the people
Well,
who
that's
are cheaper.
interesting. That's interesting because I recently went to the Ad Age Small Agency Conference in Toronto, and what was fascinating about that is that there was a lot of good sort of small to medium sized agencies. I forget what the delineation is that they specify, but there's up to a few hundred people in the business, so they're significant 20-year businesses, and a lot of them are trading on their creativity. So there's a lot of generic messaging. And there's a lot of great things about their businesses as well. A lot of talent, a lot of love for what they do, a lot of craft, etc. As you spoke about earlier. But if you're trading on your creativity and you're winning 1 out of 3 types thing, type kind of hit rate, it's quite tempting to not think that it's you, but to think it's the client. Oh, the client wasn't quite ready to buy the idea, or they probably had an existing relationship with another agency, and all of a sudden there's a lot of it's not our fault, it's not me, it's you type thinking. So you and I might take an external view on that and say, well, look, you're making this a very subjective crapshoot by just trading solely on whether your idea as great creative people was better than their idea as other great creative people. That's a tough one to consistently win. They might not translate that into actually we've got to be a bit more focused. We've got to have a genuine point of difference beyond our creativity. And I think as an industry, we're not great for advocating for ourselves. Bizarrely, we often talk about creative being, the special sauce or the secret ingredient, both for the agency and for the sector. It can't be everybody's differentiator,
Okay,
and
okay,
it
that's
doesn't
a
it
great
doesn't make
quote.
sense.
Yeah, it
So
doesn't make sense.
that's why
It's
we
table
write about that.
stakes,
Of course, it is.
right?
But again, you go and find me, you go find me 100 creative agencies, and by
Yeah,
creative I mean like advertising creative
yeah, yeah,
agencies. It's
right.
a fairly peculiar trend in that space. You go find me 100, and 90 of them will be making some similar claim about doing bold work for
Yeah,
ambitious clients, or
right.
giving our clients
Yes,
an unfair share of attention, or that
yeah.
kind of we're going to insert your brand into culture. This is why I distinguish between positioning and proposition, because really a lot of those things are just table stakes. They're re-articulating what the discipline of advertising always does.
Hmm.
So if you're spending a load of verbiage trying to communicate difference by just coming up with a different form of words, then you're going to bore your clients senseless very quickly, and it's probably indicative of a lack of focus in your business strategy.
Yep.
I'm sorry to say.
Yes. All right, great. I see by the clock on the wall that we're running long, so I'd love it if you could tell folks where they can find out more about what you're doing and maybe pick up a copy of your book.
Yeah. So where to start? So the book is Market of One, as you've kindly said. It's available from all good bookstores and probably some dodgy ones as well, but you can find it on Amazon very easily. Market of One. And another way to keep in touch with us, if you're into podcasts, is to check out our podcast, which is all about optimism, really. It's about people talking more positively about the agency space. That's called The Immortal Life of Agencies. And anything else, either find me on LinkedIn, Robin Bonn, Bonn, or come and visit codefinery.com. Um, and one of the things on codefinery.com that might be really useful is a diagnostic tool that we've developed. So if you're kind of differentiation curious, then there's a great way of assessing, what it really takes to be in a market of one, and how far, what strides you've already made. Because there's no sense reinventing the wheel if you're already doing a brilliant job.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Robin.
It's been a real pleasure. I've loved the questions, and I've loved the back and forth. So yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Cool. All right, folks, that's it for this week. I hope you join me again next time for Ditching Hourly. Bye.